Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff. Keynote session Memory Study Association conference will surely be an exciting discussion of Michael Rothberg's latest in a long list of important books, The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, published in 2019 by Stanford University Press. Our plan for the session is that Michael will give a brief presentation on the main arguments of the book. This will be followed by brief comments from our four extraordinary respondents, Sakiro Adebayo, Kasia Bojarska, Erica Lehler, and Monica Schormach, who I'll introduce before each speaks. Intellectual effervescence will surely ensue, first among Michael and the panelists, and then with questions from the audience. As in all the plenary sessions, only the panel will be visible and able to speak. So please enter your questions by clicking on the Q&A tab. The session is also being live streamed on YouTube and recorded for future viewing. And now it's my honor and pleasure to say a few words about Michael. Detail. Michael then received his PhD in comparative literature from the City University of New York's Graduate Center. Following that, Michael was on the faculty at the University of Miami and then the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And he is now Professor of English and Comparative Literature, 1939 Society Samuel Getz Chair in Holocaust Studies, and Chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at University of California, Los Angeles. Michael is the author of three extraordinarily influential books, starting with Traumatic Realism from 2000. This was followed by the landmark Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization from 2009. And now, The Implicated Subject. Not only has each of these been substantively marvelous, Michael clearly has a talent for titles. There's a long list of further subjects, projects past and ongoing, but it would take even more time out of the session merely to list them all. What I do want to say is that Michael's scholarship has been truly path-breaking and discourse-defining. The concept of multi-directional memory is perhaps the key term of what Astrid Errol has called the third wave of memory studies, following the first from the post-World War I period and the second from the 1980s. And this shapes all the work we are doing here in memory studies and the Memory Studies Association. Michael's work has been published in numerous places, including journals such as the American Literary History, Contemporary Literature, Critical Inquiry, Cultural Critique, History and Memory, Memory Studies, New German Critique, and PMLA, and has been translated into French, German, Hungarian, Polish, Russian, Spanish, and Swedish. It's a long list. Together with Yasmin Yildiz, he won a 2011-2012 ACLS Collaborative Research Fellowship for a co-authored book, Memory Citizenship, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance. And he has engaged in such public-facing venues as Inside Higher Ed, Los Angeles Review of Books, and The Nation, as well as in German language publications such as Die Zeit, the Berliner Zeitung, and Geschichte der Gegenwart. Most recently, Michael's work has entered the public realm to an even greater extent than heretofore, with his intervention in the so-called Mbebe debate in Germany, which he has once again brilliantly coined as Historischer Streit 2.0. As such, Michael's work has not just been field-defining for academics, but has shaped political debate in important ways. I could, of course, go on, but I don't want to take another second out of the session. And so, without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Michael, who would surely now receive a thunderous round of applause if we were in a lecture hall together. So, Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jeff Olick, for that really generous introduction. It's such a thrill to be here. I'm so grateful to Jeff and the other co-presidents of the MSA for founding and leading this still relatively new organization, which means so much to me and I think so much to many of us. So I'm grateful to all of them and to the organizers in Warsaw who've done an amazing job. And I'm also, of course, grateful for this dream team of respondents who you will hear from today as well. I'm going to share my screen and get started. So the central question of my book is a question about how to conceptualize historical and political responsibility. I noticed that in yesterday's really important keynote by Olivette Otele, she started with the international resonance of the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter demonstrations that took place all over the world. And she contextualized that by situating those events within a long history of race and empire. And in a sense, that's really the same starting point that I had when I set out to write the Implicated Subject. Of course, it came out before the George Floyd incident and those particular BLM protests, but it was in part a response to the murder of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his murderer, George Zimmerman, that really got me thinking about the question of the implicated subject, among other things. And so the starting point is very similar, the way I also try to situate that in a longer history of race and racialization of slavery and colonialism. But I approach it from a different angle than Olivette Otele did yesterday, and that's what I wanted to kind of start with. She talked about this history of domination and resistance, which is obviously central to these questions. But I was also, like her, motivated partly by autobiographical concerns to think about historical violence and contemporary violence and inequality from the perspective of someone who was perhaps not a perpetrator, but was still somehow, in my terms, implicated in these histories of violence. And so the first move that I make is to suggest that we need to move beyond the familiar vocabulary that we've been using, especially in Holocaust studies from which I come, to talk about violence, which is the vocabulary of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. Now, when I say we need to move beyond victims and perpetrators, I am definitely not saying we need to do away with those categories. Those categories remain essential. And I picked a couple of examples just to start, which are not in the book and are very recent. On the one hand, the question of sexual violence that arose during the Supreme Court hearings in the United States for Brett Kavanaugh, who's accused of sexual assault by Christine Blasey Ford. The other example on the right is even more recent example from the wave of anti-Asian violence that's been taking place in the United States. An older Asian American woman who was brutally assaulted and kicked to the ground by a man in New York City at the end of March. I give these illustrations to say that I'm not in any way saying we want to leave behind the categories of victims and perpetrators. They're essential. The category of the bystander, on the other hand, I find is a weak category because it implies a kind of passivity and disconnection from events. And what I want to suggest is that we need a stronger term than bystander. And here's where I will offer the implicated subject. And so what I'm calling for is a shift in focus, a broadening of the visual field or the conceptual field when we think about violence, when we think about inequality. And so here on the left, you have Donald Trump ridiculing Christine Blasey Ford back in October, shortly after those hearings. But what interests me there is not so much Trump himself, but rather the audience and the responses that you see from the audience and this kind of joy that you see. And my point here is that these are not just bystanders. This is part of the enabling machinery that makes sexual violence possible. And that creates a kind of impunity. And the same thing on the right-hand side, right? If we open up our lens a little bit, we see not only the victim and perpetrator, we see these New York City doormen simply closing the door on what they have just seen, not intervening. And my point here is not necessarily they could have prevented the violence, so they certainly could have intervened directly, but they contribute to a kind of legitimation of this sort of violence, an enabling of this sort of violence, and an atmosphere of impunity. And so my first argument then is that we need to enlarge our understanding of the actors involved in injustice, meaning both violence, various forms of domination, exploitation, and inequality beyond the most invoked figures of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. And so we need a new vocabulary, we need new categories. and I offer the concept of the implicated subject. And I use it as a kind of umbrella term, and I'll have more to say about this. It refers to those who enable, who perpetuate, who benefit from, or in other ways inherit histories of violence or structures of inequality. I emphasize that the implicated subject is a subject position. It's not an essential identity. It can be very deeply inscribed. We can, in a sense, be born into it. But in saying that it's a subject position and not an essential identity, what I'm trying to emphasize is that it's a historical category, it's a social category, and therefore it can shift and change. And it's also multiple in important ways that I'll return to. Along with that notion of the implicated subject is what I call implication. And this, here I go to the etymology of implication, which, like the somewhat close word complicity, implies a kind of folding in, right? So we are folded into events and structures. We participate in events and structures, even if we do not direct them or initiate them, even if we can't be held criminally responsible as perpetrators. We are still inside them in a certain way, folded into them. And so drawing on this, the Italian philosopher Simone Forti, I argue that the subject is a transmission belt of domination, right? To try to capture in a metaphor this indirect participation, which is nonetheless essential to the machinery of violence, to the machinery of exploitation. So the implicated subject is an umbrella term meant to capture those various forms, how those various forms of domination work. But I'm also dedicated to a kind of analytical distinction between different varieties of implication. And the largest distinction that I make is between what I call synchronic implication and diachronic implication. Synchronic implication refers to events that are unfolding in the present, right? So here I think of enablers, those of us who enable the workings of global capitalism, for example, through our consumption. Those of us who enable foreign wars through our tax dollars. That's what I mean by synchronic implication. On the other extreme is what I would call diachronic implication, right? The way that we inherit histories from the past. And here I'm calling them for the moment successors, to try to avoid some of the biological implications of a word like heir, though heir is also one I've sometimes used. And here the classic example is, the third or fourth generation Germans after the Holocaust. What kind of responsibility, what kind of historical responsibility as successors to the Nazi regime do they possess? And then in the middle, you have categories that can be either synchronic or diachronic, like the beneficiary. We benefit from actually unfolding global capitalism on the one hand, but we might also benefit from histories of imperialism that in some ways have concluded in the present, but whose afterlives and legacies live on. And then there are categories where it becomes very difficult to distinguish the synchronic and diachronic axes. And they're almost always entangled, but again, it's a more of an analytical distinction. But I think a good example of what I mean by that really closely entangled notion of synchronic and diachronic implication is what I call the perpetuator. And here I'm thinking, for example, of settler colonialism, which on the one hand has a diachronic element, the conquest of, let's say, North America, but that conquest is then reproduced and perpetuated continuously in the present, right? As indigenous people remain dispossessed and are continuously dispossessed again and again. And that's what I mean by a perpetuator. Now, I wanted to just for a second say a little bit more about one of those forms of implication, which is that of, or implicated subject, which is that of the beneficiary. In the book itself, in a chapter on the afterlife of slavery, I give this example of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project run out of London by Catherine Hall and Nicholas Draper, two historians, where they investigate the reparations that were paid to slave owners upon the abolition of slavery in the UK. And they trace the way those reparations sort of feed back into British culture over a longer durée. And so you see how the status of the beneficiary is also kind of propagated into the future. So it has that diachronic movement. Another example is one that, a more recent one, where Moshtari Hilal and Sintujan Varadaraja made a kind of social media intervention in the German public sphere, where they put forward the notion of Menschen mit Nazi-Hintergrund, people with a Nazi background, playing off a very common phrase in Germany, people with a migration background, a kind of marking of migrants, and sort of turning this back on the majority society, and say, well, what about people with a Nazi background? And what they were referring to specifically was people who have inherited wealth that comes from the Nazi period. So the children or grandchildren of people who owned factories that used slave labor in Nazi Germany, right? These are also beneficiaries in a diachronic sense of National Socialism and of the Holocaust and the dispossession and violence that took place then. And so I break down, using the example in the book again of legacies of British slave ownership, I break down the notion of the beneficiary a little bit farther, and I make a distinction between genealogical implication and structural implication. Genealogical implication refers to those who really have a genealogical family connection, right? Back, again, the grandchildren of the factory owner, the grandchild or great-great-great-great-grandchild of someone who owned enslaved people or participated in the slave trade. They bear a certain kind of genealogical responsibility, I would say. But many of us are also structurally implicated beneficiaries, even if we don't have that genealogical connection. And the example I would give is autobiographical. Myself, my family immigrated to the United States in the early part of the 20th century. I am nonetheless still a structural beneficiary of 19th century slavery by virtue of the racial categorizations which emerged out of the history of slavery. So by virtue of my whiteness, I am a structural beneficiary, even if I'm not a genealogical beneficiary. Now, genealogical beneficiaries are most of the time also structural beneficiaries, but structural beneficiaries are not necessary, as in my case, again, genealogical. I emphasized at the beginning that this notion of the implicated subject is meant to describe a subject position. And we always occupy multiple subject positions. And another way to talk about that is to say that society and history are fundamentally complex. We occupy multiple and sometimes contradictory positions in any given formation, in any given history. So I theorize what I call complex implication, which refers specifically to the way that many people are connected both to histories of victimization and to histories of perpetration, right? Are implicated in histories of perpetration or exploitation, even at the same time that they might have direct experiences of victimization or inherit post-memories, in Mariana Hirsch's term, of victimization. And I don't have a lot of time to go through this. I want to try to end pretty quickly. But here are a couple of examples that come out of my own work, where I try to map out these different forms of complex implication. So for example, one that I've written about in the book is the case of post-Holocaust Jews who often inherit a kind of post-memory of anti-Semitism, of genocide, of the Holocaust, but at the same time may be implicated in current practices of Israeli occupation and the dispossession of Palestinians. And what I try to say is that on the one hand, your contemporary implication does not erase that history of suffering, but on the other hand, that history and memory of suffering in no way subtracts from, detracts from the responsibility that you bear in the present. And you can play this out in various combinations and in a lot of different contexts, as you can see. So the question, I think, that becomes important is what is to be done, right? Implication is not a good thing. Implication is a problem that we need to try to address. And in the latter part of the book, I do that by thinking especially about the question of solidarity. And already in the introduction, I talk about this project I alluded to a little bit earlier called We Are Not Trayvon Martin, which was a response to the impunity of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman, when he was acquitted after his trial. this project rose up, and it said it tried to establish a kind of what I call differentiated solidarity, right? It said we who are white or bear some other complicated relationship to this particular case, we are not Trayvon Martin, right? We can't identify with him. We don't have the same experiences, and yet we can still attempt to be in solidarity with him and to transform and transfigure the conditions that enable that kind of murder, right? A kind of murder that has continued to take place on an almost daily basis in the United States and has various similar forms that take place in other countries around the world as well. So I'm arguing for what I call long distance solidarity or differentiated solidarity, ways of transforming and transfiguring our positions as implicated subjects, first by acknowledging them and acknowledging that we are not in the position of victims and that we shouldn't try to occupy that position, but start from somewhere else. Final slide, I'll just put up to talk very briefly about some of the things I'm thinking about now is a sort of new project. It's going to be a collective project that I'm calling Feeling Implicated. And it's a study of the role that affect in particular plays in creating implicated subjects, in connecting subjects to histories and structures that are greater than them. And I've then identified 3 different levels at which affect, I think, plays a really essential role in the question of implication. Affect can itself be a vector of implication through things like patriotism or the hatred of others, right? The affect is the very form of implication. Affect can also be a kind of unconscious or semi-conscious reaction to implication, which I think comes out especially in the affect of resentment, but can also express itself in guilt and shame. And finally, to end with that question of what is to be done and the question of solidarity, I think affect plays a really crucial role here in the way that people are sometimes able to turn against and attempt to transfigure the implication in which they find themselves. I personally have found anger to be a really important affect in those cases, but it can also come out of love. It can potentially come out of guilt or shame as well. There's no essential connection between a particular affect and the role it plays, but I think this is something that deserves further study, and it's something that I'll be thinking about in the coming months as well. So thank you for listening. I'll turn it over to my excellent colleagues now.
Michael, thank you so much for this incredibly important presentation. I'm myself particularly excited to hear more about the new project, and maybe we can correspond about that. At this point, I am going to turn things over to our discussants, each of whom I'll introduce in turn. Our first respondent is Sakiru Adebayo, who is postdoctoral fellow at the Wits Institute of Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg, South Africa. Adebayo received his PhD just last year under the title A Grievous Past in a Grieving Present, Representations of Trauma, Memory, and Mourning in Post-Conflict African Narratives. So Michael isn't the only one with a talent for good titles. He's currently working on a manuscript which investigates the politics and representations of memory in African fiction, and has been publishing a slew of new articles in various places the past year or two, so on Google Scholar.
Okay. I don't know, Jeff, are you done? I'm not sure if...
Why don't you go ahead?
The floor is yours, Adebayo.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very grateful to the Memory Studies Association and the organizers of this conference, and also to Michael for inviting me to be to participate in this wonderful session. And because of time constraints, I'm just going to dive into my what I would call provocations, that came strongly, or that came out from reading Michael's book for the 3rd time. So I have like 4 provocations, and I'm just going to read from my notes. And the first one is about white allyship, allyship in the context of racial injustice. And then the second provocation is about agency, the question of agency, individual agency in the context of historical and collective responsibility. And then the third provocation is about, revisiting the question of guilt, and especially guilt, the ethical and political purchase of guilt. And lastly, just very briefly, I would also talk about the idea of transfiguring implication, according to Michael, the way he puts it in the book, Transfiguring Implication. So to begin with white allyship, I am thinking about allyship along the lines of what Michael refers in the book as solidarity or alliance formation. I am particularly fascinated by Michael's elegant assessment of the various kinds of racial solidarities that emerged in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder. In the name of solidarity, to say that we are all Trayvon Martin is not quite appropriate, because not everyone experiences the kind of violence meted out on Black people in the US. Therefore, we are all Trayvon Martin, according to Michael, is a kind of solidarity as identification, which may in fact undermine white people's implication in the racial injustice towards Black people in the US. On the other end, to say that we are not Trayvon Martin might be a better way of expressing solidarity. But that approach is also very problematic. The kind of performance of solidarity as disidentification may inadvertently reproduce power hierarchies and end up as another practice of white solipsism. So going by Rothberg's analysis of the protests that followed the murder of Trayvon Martin, I think of white allyship. I think white allyship in the context of racial injustice is inherently flawed. The morally best option is still a bad one. I suppose my question is, how do we go beyond the inherent challenges in the performance of allyship? How do we create alliances that are not simply acts of, to use Theodore Adorno's words, that are not simply acts of clearing oneself of unpleasant political obligations? How do we move the work of solidarity beyond the terrain of what Carrie Bramen calls neoliberal niceness to a terrain of genuine human and interpersonal connections? So, what does allyship mean when your actions and inactions as an implicated subject help to produce and reproduce the positions of victims and perpetrators? Speaking of actions and inactions, another provocation that stood out for me in the book is on the subject of agency. What is the place of moral and political agency in the politics of implication? What are the ethical limits of considering oneself or being considered as an implicated subject? According to the book, it is possible to be an indirect participant in scenes of violence. And for that reason, it is possible to be implicated against your will. I suppose what I'm trying to understand is if the theory of implication overturns the place of individual political agency in post-conflict discourses of justice and restitution. While I have no issues with what Anna Arendt's idea of bearing vicarious responsibility for what we have not done, or what Michael beautifully describes as bearing prosthetic agency in the book, I think individualists would certainly raise philosophical eyebrows against the idea of associating moral agency with groups or collectives. But again, I agree with Michael that to transfigure implication, one must recognize that there are indeed indirect forms of agency that fan the embers of exploitation and domination. And the third provocation is just again to revisit the question of guilt. In the book, Michael invites us to rethink the analytical and ethical purchase of guilt. He makes a strong case for a politics of implication that shifts the question of accountability from the discourse of guilt to a less emotionally charged terrain of responsibility. He argues that Karl Jasper's description of moral, metaphysical, and political guilt are best understood as forms of responsibility. In other words, according to Michael, guilt often comes with a baggage of criminality, whereas the implicated subject has not, in a very strict sense, committed an indictable offense. Despite the reformulation of guilt as responsibility, Michael also agrees with, he disagrees with Hannah Arendt's idea that guilt is always contemporaneous with the life of the perpetrator. This means that Although Michael prefers responsibility to guilt, he seems not to dispute the possibility of feeling guilty for things which one has not directly participated in. Therefore, it seems to me that there might be more to be gleaned from framing guilt as a psychological rather than a legal phenomenon in the discourse of implication. I like to think that a decriminalized understanding of guilt may shed some light on the affective reckonings that impel the sense of responsibility in implicated subjects. By thinking of guilt in legal terms only, we downplay the role and the power of affect in the work of implication. After all, Brian Masumi, Sarah Ahmed particularly, and Lauren Berlant have shown us that the affective is also very, very political. Then finally, on combating or transfiguring implication, Michael Rothberg claims at the end of the book that it is possible to combat and transfigure implication. He notes that doing so begins with a self-conscious attempt at grasping one's position as an implicated subject and joining others in collective action. Rothberg speaks of the possibility of transfiguring implication on the basis of solidarity. In the context of racial injustice, he argues that transfiguring implication involves, quote, the deconstruction of a white identity founded on denial of implication in historical justice, end of quote. In essence, to combat implication in the context of racial injustice is to do a work of reflexivity. It is to do the uneasy but necessary work of admitting one's complicity in and proximity to the seductiveness of whiteness. To combat implication in the context of racial injustice is to decentralize whiteness. It is, in the words of Richard Dyer, to make whiteness strange. Maybe to return to my initial point about white allyship, the goal of white allyship, I think, should involve relinquishing the hegemony of whiteness and all the power that whiteness affords. It is to be at peace with not being the hero or the victim. It is to accept that it may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility. And that, for me, is what it means to transfigure implication. I think I would stop here and then we would probably have time in the discussion to talk more about some of the points I've raised. Thank you.
Adebayo, thank you so much for your comments. Sure to provoke discussion, but time is short, so we will move right on to our next respondent is Kasia Bojarska, who is assistant professor in the Department of Cultural Studies of the SWPS University in Warsaw. She has been assistant professor in the Institute of Library Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences and the Department of Late Modernity, Literature and Culture, and is author of articles and translations interested in the relations of art, literature, history, and psychoanalysis. Perhaps most relevant for our discussion today, she is also the translator of Michael Rothberg's Multi-Directional Memory. With eager anticipation, Kasia.
Thank you so much. Let me just say it's a huge honor to be here with all of you and to be able to respond to Michael's new book. I'm actually really the translator of Multidirectional Memory, and I hope Implicated Subjects will come out in Polish too. So I'm going to respond with images, with traveling images after Michael and after Hita Steyer. Some of you might not know yet that the material that Michael analyzes in his book is very much visual material coming from visual artists such as William Kentridge or Hita Steyer, and literary sources. So let me begin by showing you some. So I'm coming to you with, so my response comes to you with images, but it also comes to you from a very specific, let's say, memory place, and that is Poland and Warsaw, actually. So Michael writes in his book, the visual realm has proven ripe for the investigation of implication because of the possibilities it offers for the figurative exploration of structural problems, that is, for making tangible and perceptible the large-scale histories and social dynamics that produce implication. So I'm going to show you images that I think acknowledge implication and produce ways of coming together to acknowledge one's implication and possible ways, possible solidarities maybe. Implication comes in diverse forms, Michael writes, and as you heard in his presentation, and implicated subject represents above all not a solution but a problem. This is again something he addressed today. Implicated subjects inhabit the machinery of political violence, economic exploitation, and last but not least also ecological devastation. So we, and I saw there was a comment that we implicated in numerous ways, and it's hard to say whether there's a spot where we're not implicated, but maybe that's something also to discuss, how vast that framework is and how can we work with this. So the ultimate point, this is again a short quote from Michael, is not to dwell on or in implication, but to transfigure it, to acknowledge and map implication in order to reopen political struggles beyond the defensive purity of self-contained identities. And I'm very much interested in how the self-contained identities of Poles in contemporary Poland in relation to their troubled past can be reframed with the use of implication and implicated subjects. So what you can see here are 4 frames from Rothberg's incredible 4-hour documentary entitled Exterminate All the Brutes that was streamed on HBO in Europe and I think in the US as well, which reveals the racist underpinnings of American national mythology, but as well as European society. It has incredible form and it's super powerful. And so having watched that, I asked myself whether it implicates me in any way, whether it's Joseph Conrad, whether Joseph Conrad is enough to kind of find myself and my own history in that series, in the documentary. So this is just a beginning, and I'm going to move to images that you might have seen, as it was the opening event of this conference. Images that you might have seen and not seen at the same time. All 6 of these come from the exhibition of Wilhelm Sasnal, Polish contemporary visual artist, whose exhibition opened a couple of actually days ago at Polin, Museum of the History of Polish Jews. So what you can see from the top left is the translator, an image of Polish translator from painted after, let's say, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. What you can see next is a pic from Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And then the 4 images that you might have missed. And I'm going to give you the titles: The Arab, the Black Hat, Murzynek Bambo, and the border between Poland and Israel. To me, when I saw this exhibition, this, let's say, multidirectionality of Sasnal's memory, or the memory that he's sharing with us, or the landscape, because the title of the exhibition is Such a Landscape. So the landscape he's looking at is way vaster than the Holocaust memory in Poland, or the Polish memory only, or the Polish memory actually includes in his, at his take, many other problems. And I thought it was very interesting when I found out that Polin actually, when it shares the images from this exhibition as a press kit for critics, it doesn't include any of the 4, starting with Arab, going through border between Poland and Israel. And I found it very troubling, especially at the image that you're looking at. It's Rafał Milak's photograph entitled Stop Calling Me M-Word, taken during the demonstrations in Warsaw in 2020 as a response to the killing of, the murder of George Floyd and the protest of the Black Lives Matter protest in the United States, where we returned, and by we I mean the Polish, let's say, memory collective, we returned to thinking about our whiteness, let's say, and being implicated in the racial violence and the history and imperial histories as Poles, as Europeans. So for those of you who don't know, both the painting by Sasnal and this picture refer to a nursery rhyme, a poem written in 1934 by a Polish Jewish poet and writer entitled Bamboo the Black Kid, or actually Bamboo, an N, an N word, right? A little N word. Which is a purely racist poem, but which still is being taught to kids at school, is still being read to kids. So, and also the word that you can see in the image is still being used, despite the fact that people of color and the Black people on numerous occasions stress the fact that it's offensive. So I read Sasnal's exhibition as responding to this history as well. And in here, I'm showing you a project that you might have seen on several occasions, that is Zbigniew Libera's Lego concentration camp, a work from 1996, which functions in the canons of visual arts related to the memory of the Holocaust, obviously. Despite the fact that when it was first made public, Libera talked about its origins and thinking about camps and concentration camps in general in a very contemporary moment for the moment of its production, namely the end of the so-called Balkan Wars, and the fact that it was made public that concentration camps were active again, let's say, in Europe, despite the fact of the never again and the Holocaust memory. So and somehow this context disappeared. So the context of the actual, let's say, inspiration, right, for presenting a work of art that makes you imagine installing or building a concentration camp. Something that is not a work of memory, but rather something that is facing an active political situation. And below you can see several images from monumental project entitled Makeshift, photographs taken between 2013 and 2018 by Paweł Starzec, photographer, visual sociologist in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In this project, Starzec focuses on documenting sites where crimes were committed against civilians through the prism of their reintegration as public places. All the work resulted from the author's research based on United Nations and ICTY court documents. So far, it has been presented in the form of 3 solo exhibitions, and now it's made into an online project where you can actually go through the landscape, go through the photographs, and never see the full picture. So again, I'm asking myself, why is Starzec visiting those sites? Why is he looking at that landscape? In what way does he feel implicated by that history? And this is the final image that I want to share with you. Again, something maybe known to some of you, a work of public art entitled Greetings from Jerusalem Avenue that Joanna Rejkowska, the artist, installed in Warsaw in 2002 in the central location in the city center. This is considered one of the most iconic Polish artistic projects in public space since 1989. It was inspired by the artist's visit to Israel and Palestine in 2001, and she came back to Warsaw, and as she's saying, she wanted to transfer the view from the Middle East to the middle of Warsaw. She chose an object that is familiar in one place and which in turn defamiliarizes another place. It can be regarded as a guest or as an intruder. And it related to the idea to put the palm tree in the middle of Warsaw is related to the fact that the street that you see in the picture is called Jerusalem Avenue. So in the middle of Warsaw, we have a huge street entitled Jerusalem Avenue. And Rejkowska began asking herself, what is the story behind it? And of course, there's a story behind it. And it takes us back to 18th century, into Jewish settlement, whose inhabitants were located there. They were merchants. However, because of some problems between Polish and Jewish community, to put it mildly, they were removed, and the decision was made to liquidate the settlement. The goods were confiscated, and the Jewish houses were destroyed. So the name of the street commemorates the presence of the Jews in Warsaw, as well as the hatred of the Poles against the Jews, the collaboration, competition, and in fact, the pogrom. So elements permanently present in the history of Polish community. But then when I looked at this this palm tree kind of again with a new look, I would say, and it's very much about looking, what I'm talking to you about today in relation to implication. I saw that fact, there's a kind of an obvious fact that another street that is crossing Jerusalem Avenue is called New World, and the roundabout bears the name of General Charles de Gaulle. And you can see in the left-right corner, the monument of de Gaulle, actually, that was placed there in 1991. And then I kind of recall the images that you can see at the bottom of the slide depicting de Gaulle speaking in 1944 at the colonial conference in Brazzaville. So how to make sense of all these more or less distant references? Does it matter that the palm tree stands on the roundabout named after de Gaulle? Does it matter that the street that goes through the roundabout is Jerusalem Avenue on the one hand and the New World on the other? So things are neither hidden nor new. It is only a matter of how we see and speak in and to the archive. What desires guide us and what attachments are we responding to or compensating for? It is thus not so much thinking about specific episodes from shared past as histories to be held together and remembered in common, but rather thinking history beyond the imperial modes of thinking and recording. So the distance as well as connectedness seem crucial here. And I would leave it at this. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Kazi. We move forward with expedition to our next respondent, Erica Lehrer. Erica is a sociocultural anthropologist and curator, professor in the departments of history and sociology, anthropology at Concordia University, Montreal, where she's also the founding director of the Curating and Public Scholarship Lab. She's the author of Jewish Poland Revisited, Heritage Tourism in Unquiet Places, and co-editor of Curatorial Dreams, Critics Imagine Exhibitions, among a number of other things. As of April 2021, she is on the 7-year, $2.5 million grant awarded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Thinking Through the Museum, a partnership approach to curating difficult knowledge in public, which involves 34 international team members and 20 partner organizations. Very exciting. And now I turn the floor over to Erica.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really great to be here with you all, such respected and fun colleagues. Michael's theoretical work has always been compelling to me as a scholar, but as a curator, I've also found it useful in practical ways. So I'm going to just give a quick glimpse into how I've borrowed and repurposed Michael's notion of implication in my work in critical museology. And my key gesture here is essentially to ask, what might it look like to expand our thinking about implication and its central concerns about kinship and solidarity and historical responsibility in relation not only to events, but also to material objects? Working in Poland, the first material context I want to gesture to is the open air landscape, strewn with the remnants of the monumental and also sometimes more modest domestic physical heritage of the Jewish 10% of the pre-war Polish population who were murdered in the Holocaust, mostly by Germans, but in some villages and their surrounds also by Poles. These post-Jewish objects and sites have a highly ambivalent status. Often disinherited by their original vanished community, they have been incompletely re-inherited by the non-Jewish Poles who now constitute their closest neighbors, remaining a kind of traumatic matter out of place. And Polish artists have done amazing work to catalyze both critical reflection about, but also new communities of care and custodianship around some of these sites. Part of my earlier work in my 2013 book, Jewish Poland Revisited, Heritage Tourism in Unquiet Places, tried to make such acts of heritage caretaking visible by means of a positive vocabulary highlighting solidarity across difference in a setting of what I think Michael would call highly complex implication. My more recent interest has focused on objects in museums, particularly colonial era ethnographic museums, which in recent decades have been recognized as crucial sites of enduring violence and domination, as well, of course, as historical violence and domination, but also as platforms for demanding and enacting reparation, excuse me, reparation, restitution, commemoration, and historical education, which is a quote from Michael's book, modes of responsibility taking that Michael's work is centrally interested in. Drawing on his notion of implication, I've developed the idea of communities of implication to grasp the complex range of relationships around the legacy of difficult pasts in museum collections. The notion of a community of implication linked to an object draws our attention beyond the existing categories of so-called source or heritage communities, which are terms that have defined much of the debate around how groups of humans are recognized as being connected to culturally valuable objects. The development of the idea of the source community, a term now widely used, has been crucial in debates over ownership of cultural property, as it underlies the very legitimate claims of groups whose objects were stolen or misappropriated by beneficiaries of the colonial world order. But the term is also somewhat essentialist, focused exclusively on objects' origins and pointing only to a single source for each object, situated in a unitary, bounded cultural community. While I am in full support of museum object restitution, and I think this term is very important for that, focusing only on restitution as the end goal further risks heroizing museums who do decide to return objects, while leaving these museums' original problematic epistemologies and practices intact. A more flexible identification-based view is expressed by the Council of Europe's idea of heritage communities. This popular notion suggests that people may freely choose to embrace objects and sites and traditions that they value and want to pass on to their descendants. This idea is limited by its focus on rights to heritage, overlooking the fact that people are inscribed into relationships with objects in unequal ways that may not be chosen. Here we can think both of the problems of cultural appropriation, so ignoring the power-laden links and distinctions and loss of meanings, differentiating between, say, a white and a Cherokee person's connection to a feather headdress or war bonnet, but also of what Sharon McDonald calls difficult heritage, like Germany's Nazi-era architecture. Here it seems crucial that groups cannot simply disavow the material and other legacies of violence that they perpetrated, while victim or so-called bystander groups may also disidentify with the material legacies of their suffering, like death camp sites or ruins of former synagogues. These things, in fact, have force and act on us through their sometimes haunting presences or inconvenient presences. So on this terminological backdrop, I was looking for vocabulary to describe everything that lay between these poles of essential and freely chosen linkages between people and objects. I wanted an idea to express the many unacknowledged relationships around museum collections that are rendered invisible by limited, ossified, and typically colonial curatorial categories that silence a range of often traumatic historical and cultural resonances. The Krakow Ethnographic Museum's slogan, "My Museum, a Museum About Me," has puzzled and provoked me since its adoption in 2008, indicating a break from business as usual colonial museology. But who exactly is the me who should identify with this museum as their own? The museum's displays have long made clear that this me is an ethno-national Pole, a Slavic Catholic subject who would read as straightforward and unproblematic some highly awkward objects that are quite disturbing for many Jews. Here you can see three types of objects, which as a shorthand I've labeled the caricature, the hybrid, and the commemorative, which would be radically open to difficult history politics, and emotion if curated with implication in mind. What is today framed as, for example, amusing folk culture would be critiqued as classically anti-Semitic. What is displayed only as monocultural Polish Catholic terracotta, and here I'm talking about the image in the center, could be revealed as an object of clear intercultural exchange, as it could just as well be a Jewish ritual grager for the holiday of Purim. And what has remained generally undisplayed because it transgresses many assumptions about folk art as a form, and I'm talking about the image on the right now, could be confidently exhibited as a work of complex post-traumatic Holocaust witnessing by overlooked subaltern subjects. Jews were not the progenitors of these objects. They're not the source community, nor are they part of valued Jewish culture. So they're not part of the heritage community, but these objects implicate Jews as well as other groups in profound ways that demand a language to express. My own curatorial work has attempted to make visible the heterogeneous identifications, the difficult histories, the emotional resonances, the political possibilities, and the ethical impulses latent in such museum collections, so they may more actively and legibly implicate, and thus perhaps catalyze, or maybe we could say transfigure, new communities to care for them and through them for each other. And if you're interested in hearing more, here I'm just leaving you with the citation for my article where I spin out these ideas more thoroughly. So thanks once again for the time.
Thank you, Erica. I understand that my internet is not as stable as it needs to be, and I apologize for that. I've done all I can. So again, I apologize. Our next respondent is Monica Schirmack, who is a senior researcher at the National Council for Science and Technological Research of Argentina and a professor at the Universidad de San Martin, where she co-directs the graduate program in Latin American literatures. She's published extensively memory, women's literature, culture in Latin America with a long list. She is the editor of the series Latin American Literature in Transition for Cambridge University Press. And she's currently editing the complete works of Alberto Gerchinoff and currently working on a project that explores the kidnapping of children during the 1976 to 1983 military dictatorship in Argentina. So I wish her courage and turn her over to the floor over to her. Monica.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's really a privilege to be discussing Michael's wonderful book with these really smart and intelligent, insightful colleagues. So what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about, to offer a reflection on implication in research and public memory, specifically centered around a case. So I'll just give you a background of the place I'm talking about. This is a house in a suburb 14 kilometers south of the city of Buenos Aires. And during the 1976-1983 military dictatorship, it served as a foster home for children who had been appropriated. These were children whose parents had disappeared, been murdered, or in one case, there was a father who was in jail. The practice of kidnapping children was common during the dictatorship, but it wasn't common to place the children. Children were usually placed in families. This was an unusual case. This foster home was created, funded, supervised by a parochial church in the neighborhood. And doing research for my new project, I ran into this house. I actually grew up in the same neighborhood, so it wasn't difficult to come through this, which is a sort of a faint memory for some people. But the surprising thing for me was that although some of the cases of the children housed here went through the courts, people have been convicted of abduction, of abuse of children. there isn't a public memory of this place. So it was very difficult to think about why in a country which has a really strong policy of public memory, this house didn't figure in the memory trajectories of the area. So I started working with two graduate students, Malena Velarde and Agostina Invernici, and we thought about ways of making what had happened in this house visible. And what we first thought was to include this house in a tour of memory sites in the area, existing memory sites in the area, the most visible and the most notorious of which is a concentration camp, which is one of the largest concentration camps in the country, which served as a place of extermination and torture during the dictatorship, and which is walking distance from this house. One of the striking issues for us was how much this house figured in a neighborhood. In the reading through the legal documents, it was clear that what was going on in this house had a direct interaction with neighbors, with people in the community. So there was an overlap between what these children went through outside their home, outside this house where they were kept captive in a way, and places where they held birthday parties, the church, clubs, schools. So in this tour that we had planned, we had included this memory site, which is part of a nationwide system of memory sites, and 3 other memory sites, which are also walking distance, which are also in the neighborhood. One of them is in the high school. The other one, a second one is in the courthouse, and a third one is in one of the 2 Jewish cemeteries in the area, and it's right next to the memorial for the victims of the Holocaust. So our initial idea, the way we thought about it, was really adding this house, this foster home, to this tour that included memory sites. But then there was a clear problem with this that we ran into. The first one was that reading the legal files, especially in second and third readings, it became very clear who the victims and the perpetrators were. You could see that in the first page. You know, these were the indicted people and the people who are bringing the trials against them. But there were all these different people with different levels of implication. And we started finding that the most interesting testimonies, often the ones that revealed most for us, were these people who were not bystanders, but who had some participation. And we could see that there were different levels of implication, and that also, if subjectively they perceived themselves as being close to being guilty of something, they would be more reserved than people who had no sense of their own implications. So we started thinking of how we could include this idea of implication, and this would also make evident for us, for example, that while this house was used as a foster home during the military dictatorship, it's still used as a foster home, and the fact that children could be housed there can be traced back to laws that regulate child custody in the country and that clearly privilege certain types of families, heterosexual families, although that's probably not the case in the last few years, but white families, middle-class families, and that's a continuum. The fact that intra-home violence, that sexual violence is usually considered an issue of privacy and intimacy. So we found that there was a much longer history in which we could see ourselves as implicated subjects. So our revised tour, and in a way very similar to what Professor Ortelis street level histories that she discussed yesterday, invites personal history, include different historical narratives, and insert forgotten narratives. And this is, and I'm finishing with this slide, this is an attempt of thinking about different levels of complex implication. And in this same tour, we hope to include diachronic experiences of complex implication. And just to give you a short example, it's really unprecedented in Argentina, especially in the area of Buenos Aires, to think about how all these areas became available for European immigration. So we want to go back to the first occupation of the territory after the founding of the city of Buenos Aires, when this area was subdivided among Spaniards and made open for colonization. So we want to mark this, and also to mark certain divisions, for example, the availability of land for industry, which led to environmental abuse, and to the creation of zones where places like the Pozo de Banfield, the concentration camp I was referring to at the beginning of the presentation, is placed, but also where the most disenfranchised peoples and most of the recent immigrants to the country, the most subaltern populations live, really in contact with dangerous polluted areas. So anyway, I'll leave it here, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Monica. Michael, would you like to have, it would be great if you had some time to respond to these marvelous and stimulating comments that we've gotten?
Yeah, I mean, they're so rich and they go in so many different important directions. I definitely cannot do justice to them. And I know that there are also some questions coming in via the chat that we'll want to get to too. I mean, first I'll just say thank you to the four of you for your really careful and nuanced engagement with the ideas. Thank you to Adebayo also for the provocations, which I really appreciate and I think are really important. Gosh, where to begin, I guess is the question here. I mean, I'll go back to one of the points that Adebayo made that I think is easy for me to address, because I mean, I agree really with everything that he said, I think, but one of them I've changed my mind a little bit about the question of guilt that you raised in provocation number 3. And that's part of what I was getting at with that last slide I showed and the Feeling Implicated project is the reason in the book that I'm skeptical of the category of guilt is because of the way that it slides between a kind of affective dimension and a kind of legal dimension. And I think that can provide a certain kind of confusion. And I think it also often leads to a kind of, this resentment response, this resistance response to acknowledging one's own implications. So I was skeptical in the book that guilt could be a productive affect for the working through and confrontation with implication. But I've started to sort of step back from that a little bit and kind of open up my receptivity to the idea that, of course, affects are multivalent and we can't really dismiss them out of hand, right? And in fact, they are social facts, that guilt is an emotional response that people are going to have to the fact of implication, and especially the fact of their own implication. And instead of trying to sort of put that out of bounds, I think we need to address it directly and kind of work through it. So I totally take that point and agree with you. Though I think one of the things as we do that, we still have to be attentive to that slippage between the criminal notion of guilt and the more emotional psychological notion of guilt, at least in English, right? There's a whole question about languages here too that came up in that opening, one of those opening panels about doing memory studies across different languages that I've been thinking about too. How do you translate some of these terms out of English? And it's not at all obvious that that's easy to do. For example, German is one of the only places I've seen it, and I've already seen a couple of different words used for implication, and none of them, of course, are quite the same as English. That's a whole nother issue, I suppose. This question that Adebayo also raised about allyship. I guess allyship is not a word that I use. I don't talk about allies. I do talk about solidarity. I suppose I prefer questions of solidarity to questions of allyship. I think one of the critiques of the notion of allyship is often it seems to suggest almost that white people have no stakes in what's going on. And I think for me, solidarity is a better term because it expresses precisely that white people have stakes in these discussions as well, right? It's not just someone else's problem that needs to be addressed. It's, again, our own implication in those problems, the fact that there is a collective possibility of liberation that stands at the end of this process, and not just the liberation of others, that I think is important. Autobio also raised this question about the kind of recentering of whiteness, and I noticed that one of the questions that came in over chat also picked up on that. I think that's obviously a real risk. It's something that I thought about repeatedly while working on the project. It's certainly not the goal of the project, but it's a risk of the project. It's a way that implication, I suppose, is reproduced through the recentering of privileged dominant categories. So I think it's something we always have to keep in mind and be working against. I'll say that in terms of the We Are Not Trayvon Martin project, which I discussed, and there was a question about this as well, I'm not trying to present this as the ideal or best response. For me, it was a really interesting provocation, to pick up on that term, which allowed me to think, right? And was an occasion for thinking more about the categories of implication and implicated subject. I don't think the project itself, however, imperfect as it certainly is only about the recentering of whiteness, because if you actually look at those who responded to the call, We Are Not Trayvon Martin, you'll see that it was actually a pretty diverse group that included plenty of people of color, a Black woman who can pass as white, talking about that form of privilege, the white mother of a Black son, asking about what is her relationship to this violence, people of color who are not Black, asking about what is the specificity of anti-Blackness versus other forms of racism that one might experience as a brown person, as another person of color. So it's certainly, the project itself does not reproduce or simply recenter whiteness. Though again, I'm not claiming that this is an unproblematic or ideal project either. For me, it was an occasion for thinking. What else can I say? Gosh, I'm just looking at my notes and there's just so much different stuff. I'll say I really like, maybe one more comment, then we can start to bring in the other respondents and also maybe questions from the audience. I really like the way that, well, Erica and Kasia and also Monica are all working with visual culture, material culture, and questions of display in museums, but also tours and this sort of thing. I think that's really essential. And one of the thoughts, I'm not a specialist in those areas particularly, especially in terms of museums, but one thing I've been thinking about in terms of museums and implication is that the figure of the curator has often been a figure of what I call the perpetuator, right? The curator, in a sense, inherits these histories of, let's say, ethnographic violence in those kinds of cases, is not the initiator of those colonial projects, these curators today, but becomes the custodian of them, has been up until very recently someone who is perpetuating those sorts of colonial relationships that come out of those looted objects. And I think what you see then today in the kind of curation that Erica is doing, but a lot of people are also being forced to address around the world, in the UK, in Germany, et cetera, in the US, et cetera, and many other places, an attempt to think through the position of curator as implicated subject and to transfigure that, right? To turn against that inherited role and to try to figure out ways to create something different, to tell new kinds of stories. And I think that need to tell new kinds of stories, to look otherwise also at the stories that we already have, as Kasia mentioned in her comments, I think is a really important element of this self-reflexive project of confronting, making visible, and transfiguring implication. Let me stop there because that's already, I've talked a lot here.
No, it's great. And I'm sorry we don't have a lot more time. We've got lots of questions, but I'd like to take just a moment to see if any of the members of the panel would like to respond to what Michael just said. If you can all turn on your cameras, maybe we can have some semblance of a panel discussion.
That'd be nice.
Ah, there you are. Wonderful. Please just jump right in.
I mean, nothing super profound here, but maybe I would just say that, yes, I mean, Michael's
Okay.
really correct that that in recent years, especially with the rise of sort of independent curators rather than curators as keepers who are connected to and also deeply sort of enmeshed in certain disciplinary expertise connected to institutions and therefore kind of embedded in their logics in deeper ways. When you have these independent curators, you get much more of a sense of a curator as a disruptor rather than a curator as a perpetuator. So yes, and that's what I think many of us are trying to do. Of course, you're still working against the logic of the institution and often against politics, national and local in many ways. And I could also just say that the complex implication, I think, on the side of a museum, especially in East Central Europe, where you have these layers of Holocaust, socialism, and colonialism in terms of forms, epistemologies, and politics on the side of the museum and the people embedded there. And then on the side of someone like me, so an independent curator, in my case, I sort of have, on the one hand, the sort of subaltern cred of like, I'm the silenced Jewish person who's reacting to these super problematic representations. But on the other hand, I am the privileged white, zipping around the world, mobile academic who can come in with resources and also demand or request, I should say, not demand. So there's a gradation of power there, but change. So, my attempts to bring sort of ideas about decolonial museology to this museum in Poland have been seen as a colonizing gesture by many of the curators in it. So it's complicated, but thanks for the opening.
I think those, a couple of really important points there. I mean, one of the ways that I think we all live in implication is our embeddedness in institutions, right? Whether it's the university, whether it's the museum, or what have you. I mean, this is one of the institution is one of the prime sites of a certain kind of implication. And then complex implication. I mean, I do think that complex implication is at the source of so many difficult attempts to work through various political and cultural problems around the world, because so many of us are complexly situated. And, again, I'll take the Israel-Palestine case. I think this is one of the issues. It's hard, and I'll speak as a Jewish person. I think it's so many, we have a very strong sense of a long history of victimization that we've inherited, and that continues in the present. I know that very well. I received yesterday a neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying mail from Germany in the paper mail in my mailbox. This exists today. I realize that, and yet I think we have to be able to acknowledge that and acknowledge at the same time that we occupy structures of power, and often structures of great privilege, right? Especially those of us who are based in institutions in North America or Europe or Western Europe or what have you. So I think thinking through complex implication is a really key dimension of a lot of problems in a lot of different sites, let's say.
Other members of the panel? Adebayo? No?
Actually, I don't have I don't have much to say, but to again, maybe this would lead to another question, and that's why I'm very I don't know if I want to say something, but just to go back to the theme of this session, which is about memory and responsibility, and I have been thinking about responsibility as coming from the word response, like to respond to something. And one of the things that when I was reading the book, came another provocation is that whether in terms of restitution, redistribution of wealth, or redress, all kinds of responsibility. I am just thinking that the book actually makes a very strong theoretical claim about what is the responsibility, or the implicated subject having responsibilities. But then I'm not very sure if, the book, of the practical ways, and that's the question I want to ask Michael about the practical, because also if you look at all the context that you touched in the book, be it post-Holocaust Germany or post-apartheid South Africa or post-slavery America, the question of responsibility and redress is actually directed not to the actual perpetrators, but the implicated subject in all these three contexts. So for me, it's very clear what responsibility would look like on a theoretical level in the book. But this is not to say that Michael shies away from the question of reparations in the book. But I just want to hear, from the horse's mouth, what responsibility looks like in practical terms.
Yeah, that's a great, that's a really great question. I'll say, to try to get myself out of the question a little bit. I don't claim to offer all the answers to these questions. I do see myself as posing questions and to try to provide a framework in which we might try new answers to questions, right? And so it's, if nothing else, I hope that the analytical framework is useful in different contexts. Whether it leads directly to the right answer of what to do, I can't promise that. I don't think that I know in most of these cases. I will say that I think it depends, right? It depends on the particular history that you're seeking to redress. And I saw one of the questions came in. I think it's a very good question. It's a question I get a lot. It's just, this is such a broad category that it sounds like everybody is implicated. And in some sense, yeah, I would probably say that's true. But I guess what I would also say is the usefulness of it and the way I try to use it is always in historically specific contexts, right? And so, yeah, okay, there's this notion of the implicated subject, but what matters is what is implication in a particular place at a particular time. And it seems to me the answer of what can be done or what should be done can also only come out of that embeddedness in a particular context. So I agree with what you said earlier on, Adebayo, that the deconstruction of whiteness, the making strange of whiteness, the decentering of whiteness is, in a context like the US and other places as well, of course, really essential. This is one thing that has to take place, along with forms of material redistribution. I would say in the German context, another one that I know something about, something similar could be said about German identity, and especially the kind of ethno-racial notion of German identity, which I think is still very strong there. This also needs to be undone. It needs to be deconstructed, and we have to recognize the way that the German population has been transformed over the last 60, 70 years, right? And that the regime of memory that has come to dominate and which is often considered such a model around the world for coming to terms with the past, right? The German confrontation with the Holocaust has met its limits precisely in the way that it has come to reproduce a kind of white racialized German identity, right? And so that the people with Nazi background project that I mentioned, right, coming from so-called children of refugees, who are trying to intervene in this discussion and say, wait a second, we have a perspective here as well, and we want to mark the dominant majority society as having a particular kind of background too. We're not the only ones with our migrant background. They also have a background. It happens to be a Nazi background, right, in some cases. And so that's also a kind of provocation, which is trying to, I think, undo a certain, one of the racial legacies of National Socialism, which is the constant reproduction of a certain German identity that even functions through the memory of the Holocaust in problematic ways.
Monica or Kasia, do you want to respond, Monica?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Michael, I'm having a hard time. I think that I'm trying to think through our own implication in issues of sexism, heterosexism, in our understanding of childhood. And it's really hard. I was thinking about the way Adebayo put it when he talked about relinquishing whiteness. And I was thinking that it would be, we can make a parallel and think about relinquishing sexism. I have a really hard time in the material I presented, and which is the first time that I'm presenting it in this way, and to think about how implicated we all are in the case I presented in Argentina with these practices of the kidnapping of children, which really could take place because of certain ideas of where children are the safest, who watches children, what is the role of women towards it. So I was thinking, I wanted to ask you if you had thought about ways of talking about implication in terms of gender.
Yeah.
Michael, before you respond, can I just say that I hope nobody will be angry with me if I say we're going to extend the session by 10 more minutes, 10 past the hour, so that we have time for this discussion and time to turn to questions from the chat. I hope nobody will mind if we do. Michael.
Right. I was trying to like wait out the clock there, but I guess it's not. I'm still implicated, which is good. No, I appreciate that. Monica, that's really interesting. I mean, I think when it comes to gender identities, sexual identities, and the whole structures and systems around those, these are among the ways that perhaps that we are implicated so very deeply. And I suppose this is also true for racialization as well. I said that it's not an essential identity, it's a subject position implication. I hold to that. I think that's an important distinction. But I think some of these forms of implication are so deeply and affectively inscribed within us that I don't want to imply that it is in some way easy to even grasp, no less transform or transfigure those forms of implication. So I think you're getting at something that's, really, really crucial there. The way that we are, again, almost born into, or actually born into, certain gendered, racialized, sexualized systems that pre-exist us, right? And create very kind of sometimes seemingly intractable forms of implication. And yet, I think we can also point to gender as a place where we see really significant transformations happening right at this very moment, right? Through the greater salience of trans identities, through the ways that different languages are trying to mark and unsettle gender identities, like in German with you put these little Sternchen, these little stars, right, in between the kind of masculine feminine form. So there are all sorts of ways that I think people are starting to try to undo these very deeply encoded structures. I tried to, in that initial example, which again is not one I really discuss at length in the book, and not one where I feel like I am the greatest expert, this question of sexual violence, but I think it's a really crucial one for thinking about implication, showing that audience for Trump and this kind of joy and glee that even women, right, in that instance are getting from the mockery of another woman who was in all likelihood victimized, right, by a rapist, a very powerful white male rapist. And so I think, again, this is one of those places where we see a kind of complex implication, where we can occupy subordinated positions and yet at the same time be implicated in reproducing the conditions that make that violence possible.
Kazu, did you want to get in, or shall I turn to questions from the audience?
Yeah, I keep looking at the questions coming in all the time, and maybe we should open it. I don't, all of the things that we are discussing here are just so fundamentally important. Again, one of the questions being, what's the relationship between the implicated subject and the political subject, something that Michael addresses in the book, and it's very important how one makes from one position to another position. Is it a direct, direct way, or is it empowering, or is it disempowering? Acknowledging implication. So maybe I'll just stop here and we can just move on to the questions that are coming in chat.
Let me perhaps cluster some questions, some of which I think have been answered, but don't hurt to ask again, and I'll just read 3 or 4 of them. From Angelica Bama, given the vicious definition of the implicated subject that you propose? Isn't virtually everyone an implicated subject in one way or another? If that is so, what do you find is the most useful analytical as well as political purchase of the notion of implication? Then connected to that from Anne St. John Stark, how long a time passes between the violence and the end of a social political group having the label perpetrator, e.g. slaves and the end of slavery and the white population in the US. How long are whites implicated? One more question from down below. From Katja Oyherman, what can be the status in terms of implication of contemporary immigrants from different places into the United States? So let's just try to address those questions first before moving on to a few more.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. No, those are all really good. I mean, I tried to address Angelika Bammer's question a moment ago in saying that while I offer this as a kind of umbrella category, as a very broad category, as a category that probably all of us occupy at some point, I think it's most useful when we specify, right? When we consider it in particular histories, in particular contexts. So I hope I made that clear. In terms of this question of how long does implication persist, this is really interesting. And you could also ask, like, how widely does it, spread out, I suppose, from a particular site of violence? Again, that has to be answered in historically specific terms. One thing that I would say in terms of clarification is that I'm not saying that this category of perpetrator is transmitted across generations. I'm precisely trying to offer an alternative to that conception, right? So the perpetrators of transatlantic slavery and the transatlantic slave trade are no longer with us. The question is what remains in their wake. And this is what I want to call implicated subjects in terms of a diachronic implication. Now, how long does diachronic implication continue, right? So to go back to stick with perpetrators for a moment, right? Here's where I agree with Jaspers, I agree with Hannah Arendt. You can only be guilty of a crime that you actually perpetrate, right? That you actually enacted, right? So none of us are guilty of things that happened, are perpetrators of things that happened before we were born, but we may well be implicated subjects in those histories. But how long does that implication last? I think it lasts as long as the conditions persist that were created by those initial acts, right? So again, to go back to the question of settler colonialism, my family was not in the United States in the early centuries of settlement and the conquest of North America. We are not perpetrators. Nobody alive today is a perpetrator of that history of conquest, and yet settler colonialism happens every day, right? It's a structure and not an event, as Patrick Wolf said. And so how do we capture our responsibility in relationship to that structure? To me, it doesn't make sense to talk about us as perpetrators of settler colonialism. It does make sense to me to talk about us as implicated subjects of settler colonialism, right? And so here's a place where I disagree, for example, with Ariella Azoulay, who talks about leaving the position of the perpetrator. She's speaking as an Israeli, and it's a somewhat different location, obviously, from me as a diasporic figure. But at least as a diasporic Jew, I don't feel like I'm a perpetrator of the occupation of Palestine, but I do feel like I'm an implicated subject, both ideologically as a member of the Jewish diaspora who is interpolated by the state of Israel, but also, and maybe even more importantly, as a tax-paying American who contributes toward the billions of dollars of military aid that go to Israel every year, and that is the kind of armature of that occupation. So again, not perpetrator, but implicated subject. How long does it last? It lasts as long as the conditions persist. And so if, for example, in the case of, let's say, slavery and the afterlife of slavery in the United States, I agree with people like Saidiya Hartman and many others who would argue that, we live precisely in the afterlife of slavery. That means that the conditions that were created under slavery, the racialization of American society, persists and can be traced back to those, seemingly long ago crimes. They are still alive today. We still live within them. And that's why we are still implicated in them, even if we are not perpetrators of those deeds. In terms of immigrants, the last question, yeah, this is a question that really fascinates me. I think it's, I don't want to go back to the PowerPoint, but there was in the complex implication mapping, I talked about racialized immigrants in a settler colonial society, right? And so, in the US, for example, I think all of us who are not indigenous are in some sense implicated in that project of settler colonialism, even if we might also be racialized immigrants, right? The place I've actually investigated this most carefully or most in an ongoing way is actually Germany, and thinking about the way that racialized immigrants, say Turkish Germans, relate to the memory of the Holocaust, and arguing that, yeah, Turkish Germans are implicated in that history as well. They do bear a responsibility to remember. At the same time, they are racialized and victimized in the present in all sorts of ways, and we have to factor those in together, and we have to consider both of those together and hold them together. And that's the challenge of thinking about complex implication, but that's the challenge of thinking about history and politics in general. Those things are complex.
So just a thought about the long-lasting implication. Would you say, Michael, there's something as transgenerational transmission of implication, or do we?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, absolutely. I think there is transgenerational transmission of implication. And I've been deeply influenced by Mariana Hirsch's work and the notion of post-memory. But for me, post-memory works best as the intergenerational transmission of the trauma of victims, right? And I really feel like it's useful to have another term to describe transgenerational transmission on the side of perpetrators. And it doesn't mean that sometimes that transmission is also traumatic. I think it can be, but for sure. But it obeys a different logic. It's morally and politically distinct in my perspective. So I prefer to talk in those cases about diachronic implication than simply to subsume that under post-memory. I think, again, post-memory is another term that really travels beautifully into all sorts of contexts. It was actually Mariana Hirsch who helped me think this through. It makes sense when it's used as specifically as possible. And for me, post-memory, the specificity of it has to do with its transmission on the side of victims. I think for perpetrators, we need another vocabulary, and that's part of what I'm trying to provide with the notion of implication.
Thank you. There are so many questions. And we're never going to get to them. I will just cluster two more and questions and comments have not been addressed, but they're there in the chat for posterity. From Irina Trokonis, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the relationship between implication and representation, the need to see us implicated in cultural production, art, etc., in order to recognition of our
Jeff, you're fading out.
Mentioned at the end, and the creation of certain spaces or places. Michael, you can see the question from Irina in the chat.
Yeah, okay, let me answer the question about representation. And I wasn't sure if there was a second one. Maybe if there is, maybe you can say that again afterwards. Yeah,
there's just a question below from Irina. What's your recommendation to researchers working on traumatic memory with regards to reflection on one's own position?
I saw that. Okay, I saw that one too. Yeah, okay, let me take that one first.
We'll have to end after that, but.
Okay, I think I understand. So in terms of how one should inscribe one's own positionality in one's research, my mentor in graduate school was Nancy K. Miller, a really important feminist critic who wrote a book called Getting Impersonal. And I wrote a response once for one of her classes where we were invited to do autobiographical performances, and I called mine Getting Impersonal. And I have always been pretty reluctant to speak, or I had always been pretty reluctant to speak autobiographically and personally, especially in the context of my research, even though there are clearly strong personal connections in everything I do. But I realized at a certain point while writing this book that this really is a kind of autobiography. I mean, that it really is a self-interrogation. And it really comes out of my experience as a white Jewish American man, Ashkenazi, et cetera, and my attempt to understand my position, right, in the histories in which I have been inscribed in the society in which I live. I think there are certain moments when it's important to mark that. Absolutely. I don't think we should pretend that we're unmarked. And I think especially those of us who occupy predominantly dominant positions have a kind of responsibility to make that kind of privilege visible. So, I mean, I don't have a prescription for it. I think what's ultimately important is the work that you do with it more than the autobiographical performance, I suppose. But the autobiographical performance can also be important, especially at particular moments. It could be good to reveal those kinds of implications. In terms of representation, I'm a literary and cultural critic, so I always go to representations, especially artistic and literary ones, to think through problems. And I think of representations primarily as alternative modes of theorization. And so that's the way I use people like William Kentridge in the book, or Hito Steyerl, who Kasia also alluded to. These are really sophisticated thinkers and not just artists. So I see this as theory embedded in artworks, and I try to draw out their insights about, in this case, implication. But I guess I would also say that representation can itself be a site of implication, right? And that certainly representations of all sorts of racialized, gendered, sexualized sorts are vectors of implication too, right? That, you know, and so producers of those things have a responsibility, but I think somehow also audiences and consumers of those things have a responsibility too, because we are also implicated in the kinds of representations that have been created for us, right? We can't simply blame Hollywood or what have you. We are also looped in, I suppose, in a certain way. So I think representation is both a site for the production of implication and the propagation of implication in all sorts of ways, as I think a lot of people have show in different realms. But for me, they can also be exciting ways of thinking through and critiquing those same modes of implication, right? And so that's, yeah, and again, that sort of comes out of my training, I suppose. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I don't really do ethnography, I don't know how to analyze in a sociological mode particularly. I tend to work through representation. And I think that doesn't tell us everything, but I think it can tell us a lot and show us a lot.
Okay, so we are more than out of time. It's just past 11 a.m. in Los Angeles. Michael may be done for the day. I can say that for my part, I've been listening to a couple pieces of music over and over again lately and hearing new depths every time. I have the feeling the recording of this session is going to serve that same function for me, and I'm going to go back to it over and over again. So I want to give my warmest and sincerest thanks to our panel, Adebayo, Erica, Kasia, and Monica, and especially to Michael for talking with us about this book, and in fact for the extraordinary book, parentheses, S on parentheses, and for all his work in the field of memory studies. So thank you all so very much. It's been a terrific session, and I'm deeply grateful to you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was really inspiring for me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.